Hi. Well, moving forward to final assembly, and I have previously loosely assembled the entire unit and tested it for movement, and what I discovered is that the gears seem to be fine, but the bearings are a little bit rougher than what I think they should be. The primary culprit is this one right here, and this is the critical bearing in the whole unit. I'm going to give you a close-up view of it. As you can see, it's a 1/4 inch on the inside, and it is 3/8 of an inch on the outside. It has a flange on it so that it's intended to sit over the top of that outer shaft. And the problem with the bearing is that it is so small that when I press fit it into the end of the shaft, and I had only a 1/2 thousandths of a press fit, it compresses the clearance between the bearings and the outer race, and it causes the bearing to run rough. And so I decided to take a different tact with this bearing and to go with this stuff right here. This is Loctite 680, and it's intended for bearing seats, and it allows you to have as much as 2 thousandths clearance between the bearing and the shaft, and it will fill that gap, and it will lock the bearing onto the shaft with a shear stress of 3,200 pounds per square inch, which is more than sufficient for anything like this, and that would prevent the bearing from spinning on the shaft, which is the major problem. I'm going to go ahead and install this bearing, but the critical problem is to not allow the Loctite 680 to get into the bearing itself, which of course frees the bearing, and that'll be the end of that, and then it'll be extremely difficult to get out. You can release 680 with heat about 300 degrees, so if you heated it with a heat gun, it should release and pop off, but it's probably going to ruin the bearing, and there's no need to do that yet. So what I did is I reamed the end of this out, and I reamed it out so that instead of being a press fit, it's just a loose slip fit now, and we're going to try that. This bearing back here is also a little rougher than is to my liking. I don't like the feel of this bearing. I just don't like it. If you could feel it, you would find that it runs, well, it doesn't run smooth even over a short distance, and then it feels like little obstructions in it of some kind. It's not what I want. I think part of the problem is that I had press this bearing on. I'm going to have to press it off again, and then we'll see whether the bearing runs free when it's off the shaft, and then that would indicate that there's something about the fit between the shaft and the bearing that's causing the problem. I went over to the press and I pressed the bearing off, and I had put a fairly tight press fit on this, and as you can see, the bearing runs beautifully when it's off. So it's the same problem. It's simply that by pressing it onto the shaft, I'm expanding the inner race enough so that it's interfering with the clearance between the balls and the races. So I'm going to have to bring this down a little bit. Maybe I just use some emery to take 1,000 or 2 off of it, and then we'll drop this down to a loose sliding fit and use 680 on it to hold it. And I've got retaining rings on both sides to handle the thrust loads. Okay, I put a little, I chucked this up in a collet in the lathe, and I used a little emery cloth to bring it down to just under 0.5 inches. It's 0.4995 or something like that. And it's just about right now. The bearing just greases over the top with what I'd call a loose sliding fit. And at that, with that, see, the bearing now is free to move, which is the way we wanted it. And when we put it in here, we're going to do exactly the same thing, because we can't afford to have the bearing compressed from the outside either. That won't work. But this is already a pretty loose fit, which I may relieve just a little bit more on the inside here. Notice this steel, which is the 4130, when you polish it like that, it's pretty shiny, because it's actually got a good amount of chrome and molybdenum in it to get the high strength properties out of it. Neither of which would be but that looks pretty good right there. And I'll get this other retaining ring back on it, and we'll let it cure for a while. Well, I got to do the other bearing first. Okay, that's a pretty good fit there on that bearing now. Up here. Okay, I'm going to set this aside now. It says it has a cure time of 6 hours. We're going to let that cure before we reassemble the rest of the box. Hello again. I think we've gotten these pieces to the point where we can begin a final assembly on the entire machine, and that's going to start with these main shafts that we've been working on the bearings. I'm pretty happy with the bearings now. The main bearing here, this is the outer shaft main bearing. It's the main thrust bearing for the entire machine. It feels good. It's nice and smooth, rotates freely. The retaining rings are in place on both top and bottom, and they're going to help it with thrust loading. And I have secured the bearing to the shaft with 680. And we got the same situation going here in this nose bearing, this very small, delicate nose bearing, but it feels real good. It's nice and smooth, and that's what we want. It too has been secured with 680. And To begin the assembly, we're going to take the inner main, this is the inner shaft, the one that goes clean through the machine. It already has its main bearing assembled onto it, just below this, the inner main gear. So we'll begin the assembly by just dropping the inner shaft into the outer shaft and working it through here. Very tight fit as the shaft goes through the bearing. Sometimes it takes a little bit of convincing to get it in there, because there's no clearance between the inside of the bearing, the inner race, and the outer race of the shaft. But that feels pretty good. Now, since there's no bearing on the inside of the back, this inner shaft flops around a little bit here, but that is going to be cured by the seat when this inner main bearing sits into the bottom plate. Okay, so we'll go ahead and drop this into the case. The only difficult part of that is getting the holes lined up. I've got 3 6x32 cap screws here to hold it in place. And I think they are going to be more than adequate to get this job done. So we'll secure this and get these holes lined up so that we'll just make that just finger tight there until we get the rest of it assembled. Feels good. Okay. The next thing we'll do is, this is the bottom plate. The bottom plate goes, the tricky part is making sure that we get the bearing outer race into the bearing support that's been cut into the bottom plate. But it should drop right in there. And it does. And that feels good. As does this one. Alright. Next thing I'm going to do is put this little retaining ring onto the inner, main shaft. And that drops right into that retaining ring groove. Alright. This, as you recall, is what we've been calling the first idler. It picks up the motion from the main drive gear, which is right there, and transfers it up to the second idler. So we have to fit it in so that its bearing drops into its bearing retainer. These bearings have been fixed to the shaft as well with 680. Just wheel a little bit to get it in there. Okay, that's good. Nice and smooth. And now this is the second idler, and that picks up the motion from the top gear of the first idler and transfers it up to the outer main gear right here. Hold your mouth just right to get it in there. Okay, so far so good. This is the top plate, and this is the outer shaft main bearing, nose support, and it has a needle bearing in it that fits right over the top of this part of the shaft. Both the inside of the needle bearing and the outside of the shaft are the same diameter, so it's a very close sliding fit. And then of course, the trickiest part is to get this to accept those two bearings, but it does. And I will put these two screws in here. Now, what we're missing, of course, are the screws that hold the whole gearbox together, and they're 1032s, and they'll go right into these three holes. But they are also going to support the gearbox as in its mount to the firewall, and the motor, of course, will be back here. So we can check the operation of the gearbox, and we've got nice, smooth operation. It's yet to be lubricated. To lubricate it, I'm going to pull it apart again, and I'm going to press grease into all the bearings, and then this forward nose bearing will lubricate with oil because it's quite a distance from the rest of the bearings in the case. But it feels really good. I'm pretty pleased with the action of it. The final part of what we're going to do is take these nuts and put them on. This nut, which is a left-handed nut, its purpose in life is to provide a back support for the propeller itself, which slides over this threaded area of the outer main shaft, and there will be a washer above on the top of this nut. Then the propeller hub will sit on top of that, another washer and another nut in order to secure the whole thing in place. And what I will eventually probably end up doing is securing these nuts with 680 to act as a flat, to be able to grip it with a wrench in order to be able to tighten down. The nuts will secure the rest of the propellers in place. But for right now, we'll leave them like this because we can't assemble and disassemble the thing with those things secured in place. But there it is. The next step is going to be to lubricate it and then to test it. Thanks.